Clause 8 has further two subclauses, that is 8.1, which is operational planning and control, and clause 8.2, which is emergency preparedness and response. Clause 8.1 has further subclauses, which we shall discuss in next slides. Clause 8.1.1 requires that organizations shall take the risk control strategies as per the nature and scale of the risk for all processes. Clause 8.1.2 requires that the organization shall eliminate hazards and or reduce the risks using the hierarchy of control, that is, elimination of hazards, substitution with less hazardous process, equipment or raw material, engineering control, administrative control, and finally the personal protective equipment. Why are the personal protective equipment considered the least effective from the hierarchy of controls? Pause this slide and think of the answer before I explain. It's because personal protective equipments do not eliminate or isolate the hazards. Moreover, they may create additional hazards by virtue of their use. For example, earmuffs can reduce a person's capability to respond to a fire alarm. Clause 8.1.3 requires that the organization must systematically deal with the changes which may influence OHS performance of the organization. Changes can be process change, raw material change, workplace layout change, legal requirements change, organization structure change, changes in the skill level of the workforce, changes in organizational knowledge, etc. How do you think the changes at the workplace can affect the OHS performance of the organization? Explain with example. Pause this slide and think about the answer before I explain. Changes at the workplace can have a significant effect on the OHS performance of the organizations. Here are a few examples of how changes at the workplace can impact OHS performance. Introduction of new equipment or process. The introduction of new equipment or process can create new hazards that were not present before. It is important to assess these new hazards and ensure that proper controls are in place to minimize the risks of accident or injuries. Changes in the workforce. An increase in the number of employees or changes in the skill level or experience of the workforce can impact OHS performance. For example, a new employee may not be familiar with safe work practices, or a change in the skill level of the workforce may lead to increased risk of accident or injuries. Modification to the workplace environment. Changes to the physical layout of the workplace, such as the addition of new equipment or the removal of safety barriers, can impact OHS performance. It is important to assess the potential impact of these changes and take appropriate measures to mitigate any new hazards. Changes in the regulations. These can impact the OHS performance of an organization by requiring new procedure or controls to be implemented. For example, changes in occupational health and safety regulations may require employers to provide additional training to employees or to implement new engineering controls to reduce the risks of exposure to hazardous substances. Clause 8.1.4.1 requires that the organization shall ensure that product and services being procured from external sources meet the requirements of OHS management system and does not pose a risk to occupational safety and health of its workers. For example, if oxygen cylinders are being used by the workers to carry out some task, then due to an error, delivery of nitrogen instead of oxygen can have severe health and safety issues. Explain with an example how an ineffective procurement process shall compromise the health and safety of the workers. Pause this slide and think of the answer before I explain. An ineffective procurement process can compromise the health and safety of workers in several ways. For example, failure to assess hazards. When procurement processes are ineffective, there may be a failure to assess the hazards associated with the procurement of new equipment or materials. This can result in the procurement of equipment that is not suitable for the workplace, which can pose a risk to the health and safety of employees who use it. Failure to ensure compliance with regulations. An ineffective procurement process may not take into account the requirements to comply with relevant health and safety regulations, such as the requirements for certain equipment to be certified or tested. This can result in the procurement of equipment that is not compliant, which can pose a risk to the health and safety of employees who use it. Clause 8.1.4.2 focuses on the hazards which are created due to the subcontracting activities. For example, the on-site contractor's activity may pose health and safety risks for the organization worker. The on-site contractor's own workers may be impacted by the work being carried out by the organization. Contractor activities that may impact the health and safety of their interested parties at the workplace, for example, visitors, member of the public, etc. The clause requires that suitable selection criteria be established and followed when selecting the contractors to ensure health and safety performance. How do you include the contractors in your organization's OHS management system? Explain with an example. Pause this slide and think of the answer before I explain. Consider a construction company that hires contractors to work on a project. The company could include contractors in its OHS management system by: Number 1. Developing a clear policy that outlines the expectation for contractor performance in terms of health and safety. Number 2. Assessing contractor performance through regular site inspections and monitoring compliance with the OHS policy. Number 3. Providing contractors with training on the company's OHS policy and procedures, including the use of personal protective equipment and emergency procedures. Number 4. Collaborating with contractors on risk assessments and implementing appropriate controls to minimize the risk of accidents or injuries. Fostering a culture of safety by encouraging contractors to take an active role in the identification and control of hazards, and by promoting open communication and collaboration between the company and the contractors. Clause 8.1.4.3 requires that the organization shall control the outsource function in such a way that the outsource function does not affect the organization's OHS performance. For example, if the organization has outsourced surface treatment work to a third party, the outsourced function is carried out by the third party at their own premises by their own workers. However, the organization may need to send its own workers for quality control or acceptance of the finished products, and may be exposed to some health and safety risk due to their presence at the contractor site. What is the moral aspect of outsourcing, keeping in view occupational safety and health? Pause this slide and think of the answer before I explain. When outsourcing work, organizations have a moral obligation to ensure that the same level of health and safety is provided to the contractor's employees as is being provided to their own employees. This means that the organization must ensure that contractors are trained in terms of OHS requirements, that the work environment is safe, and that adequate controls are in place to minimize the risk of accident or injuries. Organizations also have a moral obligation to monitor the performance of contractors and to take appropriate actions if a contractor is found to be in breach of OHS regulations. This includes taking steps to address any hazards, providing additional training or resources, and terminating the contract if necessary. Clause 8.2 requires that the organization shall foresee the potential emergency situation due to the context in which it operates. Based on the nature and scale of potential emergency situations, the organization shall plan and implement an effective emergency response or evacuation procedure. The organization shall also test the procedure through rehearsal to check its effectiveness. Lesson learned shall be documented. The emergency response procedure shall be communicated to all interested parties, and where needed, suitable training shall be provided by the organization. The organization needs to maintain and retain the documented information against this clause. What is an emergency and how is it created? Pause this slide and find the answer before I explain. An emergency is a situation that poses an immediate risk to health, life, property, or the environment. Emergencies can be created by various factors, including natural disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods, or by man-made incidents such as fires, chemical spills, or transportation accidents. Emergencies can also be created by equipment failure, power outages, or other technological incidents. Emergencies can also occur in the workplace, for example in the event of a fire, explosion, or toxic release. In these cases, emergency response teams may be required to respond to the incident and evacuate workers, control the spread of the emergency, and provide medical attention if necessary.